And we're back. Okay, thank you for your patience. If you were watching the last video and were waiting for the part about the SSL mixer, I definitely planned to get to that in the last video, but it got really long. So this time I'm gonna go straight to the mixer. We've already cleaned everything out in terms of frequencies that we don't want. We've made some decisions as far as how loud we want things to be, whether we want them to be in the front or in the back of our mix. Not so much how loud, we're gonna do that on the mixer. But now we're gonna deal with what I actually use the SSL mixer for. And before we get to the mixer, one last thing. I am going to mix in mono from here on out. I'm gonna drop a Selig gain on the end of my chain and bypass everything else in the mastering suite. And I'm just gonna click mono. So what I'm gonna do from this point is I'm gonna just turn on the track. I'm gonna turn everything down and try to turn down whatever I hear first. I hear the snare. Then it was the bass the second time. This is also very subjective, but I don't hear anything jumping out when I just slide the fader up from the bottom. That's a good place to start. Now I'm gonna just take a listen to the kick and the bass. Now here's where I'm actually going to use the EQ on the SSL mixer. A lot of people had questions about why wasn't I using the EQ earlier. I wanted to use that EQ in my template just for cleaning. This EQ I'm going to use to lock things together. So I'm going to notch a frequency out of the bass and give a little bump in the kick. That notch is going to let each sound have its own space sonically, especially in that bottom range. The reason why they call it notching is that everywhere that I cut on the bass, I want to give a little notch up on the kick drum and vice versa. That helps them really kind of lock together as opposed to fighting for the same space. We're going to do the same thing with the tambourine, the clap, and the snare drum, which also have a tendency to compete. We want to be able to hear them separately without panning before we do anything else, so that we make sure that there's sonic space for them, and then when we do pan, it'll be even more pronounced. Now on the guitar, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all the low end because I don't want it. I want to make as much space as possible for the kick drum and the bass, and that's going to take us into the next section of stuff that I want to do with the EQ, which is I'm going to low pass and high pass. There's no reason to have anything from the guitar below 120 hertz as far as I'm concerned. Now, if I'm going to add a vocal to this, I'm probably going to get rid of some of the high end on everything that doesn't need it as well. The clap doesn't need it, tambourine doesn't need it, and now that I have my kick drum and my snare separated, then the rest of my drum tracks as far as the toms and the overhead mics on the drums don't need it either. I'm going to get rid of everything above 15K on the drums as well, and on the clap because I don't want it to bite too much. So far we've went through and made sure everything is a pretty good clip in terms of relationship to each other, and we've also notched a couple things so that there's space for things to link together later on in the mix. What that leaves us with is some pretty good separation, especially considering that we're listening to this in mono, so we can hear every individual ingredient, and that is what is key to a clear mix. Now what I'm going to do is try to use reverb to make everything sound like it's in the same space. I would normally take a little bit more time than I'm going to right now to pick the reverb that I'm going to use, but I'm already spent a lot of time on this particular thing, and so I just want to kind of get to it. I'm just going to turn them on all the tracks and then adjust the gain of the reverb accordingly. Also remember, if I like the reverb on each individual instrument relative to each other, I can just pull the whole master down on the return over here. For my taste, I tend to like a little bit more reverb on things like a clap and the snare that are really short, so that can really let that tail show if it's really beautiful. But things like the bass and the kick drum, I like to leave a little bit more dry. That also helps them stay more to the front of the mix. Another use for that EQ on the SSL mixer is to place things forward and backwards in your mix. Right now, to me, the clap is a little too forward, so what I'm gonna do is take some of the high end off to help pull it backwards. Also, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to use this warm echo, and I'm gonna turn the ducking way up to like 80 or 90%. And I'm gonna add some to the guitar, a little taste to the tambourine, and the clap as well. Just a hair below where it sounds like audible as like a second occurrence. Now that I have those effects in, I'm gonna go back and pull the fader all the way back down again and do that same test that I did in the beginning. I wanna make sure there's not something that jumps out to me as being loud right when I first pull that fader in. And I still hear that snare first, so I'm gonna pull it back a little bit, and a little bit of the clap. Hope you have headphones on, sorry. Now here's where the gain staging crowd is gonna say, hey look at how high everything is. It would have been clipping if you brought the master back up to 0 where it's supposed to be. My response to that would be, in general, gain staging was a lot more important when noise was more of a problem. But because turning up the faders does not introduce any more noise, it's not really as much of a problem here. And frankly, as long as it's not clipping on the way out, I don't care if I leave the master fader down 3 dB to get that headroom that I need to master. This is the stage where I would start thinking about panning. As far as your stereo field, you want things to occupy a separate space this way as well as this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably leave the kick and the bass relatively close to the center because I notched them pretty well, and then I'm going to put everything else kind of a little bit out to the side and a lot out to the side depending on what it is. I'm going to turn off mono, and if I wasn't being a little bit lazy here, I would go through each track, check it in mono and stereo, and make sure there's not a huge jump in volume, because that's a sign of phase cancellation. Kick right up the middle. Snare, I'm going to move just a little bit over to the right. The guitar is already over to the right. The tambourine and the clap I'm going to put on opposite sides. It doesn't really matter. I'm also going to go back over to the Reason drum kits and pan my hi-hats a little to the right. At this point, I would only need to use my SSL compressors if there was a problem that I didn't already resolve with the compressor that I used in my template on each track. I do like to use the master compressor to glue everything together. I like how it glues everything together when that effect is subtle. So nothing above 4 dB, something in that 0 to 4 dB range for that. Just a little bit of glue to help hold everything together. Now, I also highly recommend at this point bringing in a reference track of something in the same genre that's a commercial master, so you can get an idea of their mixing priorities. And this is something also that you should bring through to the master. This is a finishing kind of polish that you want to make sure that you added. The last thing I wanted to touch on was stereo imaging, because you can do this in the master, but it is something that you should probably be intentional about when you're mixing. So you can either control the spread of a stereo track by changing the width here, and you can also add a stereo imager to any track that you feel you want to be super wide, so that you don't have to deal with widening the whole thing in the master, which can take away from some of the punch. And just for giggles, I'm going to slap an ozone in at the end of the chain so you can hear what just a basic master would sound like on it. Hopefully my computer won't explode. I know that was a really generic master, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what it might sound like at a volume that's kind of commercial level. Did I miss anything this time? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you found something that I did useful to you today. I have t-shirts for sale on my website, so if you want to go ahead and grab one of those, I would greatly appreciate it. And also, if you want to check out my work outside of teaching, please check out my band Groove Orchestra. I have tons of stuff on iTunes and Spotify and whatever streaming service that you use, and definitely feel free to go on my website and buy physical CDs if that's your speed. I definitely forgot about side chaining. I'll just do another video on that. Things were sounding cool without it, but that's definitely something that helps glue things together. Hopefully today I gave you something that you can use in your own production. I'm Samuel Prather. I hope I gave you a reason to create.